morning, everyone. Welcome to the first of two learning sessions designed to promote the importance of using climate and disaster risk information in designing pro-poor housing investments. My name is Samantha K. Lisay, and I am a design architect at Build Change Philippines. I am your session moderator for today. I'm looking forward for this session because I am involved in the microfinance project that will be cited as an example and later in the discussion. So let's now meet our resource person and co-lead of this session. She is none other than Engineer Lizzie Blaisdell Collins. She is the Vice President for Engineering at Build Change. To know more about her, you may access her bio at the session description below or at the speakers page of the platform. May I present Engineer Lizzie Blaisdell Collins. Good morning.
Good morning, Sam. Thank you for the introduction. I'm so pleased to be here with you, and good morning to everyone participating in this learning session. Better housing for the urban poor is critical. It's the ultimate protection for families, as we'll talk about shortly. So I'm so encouraged to see so many participants in this session who have prioritized learning about it. And I'm looking forward to everyone's active participation and a productive discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Lizzie. For this learning session, we will have two parts. For the first part, we will cover the importance of using climate and disaster risk information in designing pro-poor investments in housing. For the second part, we will cover the use of these climate and disaster risk information in designing the pro-poor investments in housing. So please take note that for better time management, we will have the open forum at the end of the presentation. However, the question and answer box at the right side of your screen will be kept open throughout the session. So please feel free to type in your questions or comments on the topic. If you find posts that you think are important or similar to your question, you can sure to click the like icon. We will prioritize the questions that are most liked in the forum. So please make sure to use the chat box also and answer the feedback box later. So before we hear Lizzie's presentation, I'm sure you're all eager. Let's first have an introductory question. So for this activity, please refer to the Mentimeter below your live stream. So our question for everyone is, how do climate and disaster events, including future climate change, affect housing for the urban poor? Again, kindly input your answer in the Mentimeter below your live stream. So this is just like an introductory question where we want to know what you know for this question. So the question again is, how do climate and disaster events, including future climate change, affect housing for the urban poor? Let's see your answers for a while. So, okay. You can keep thinking, what are the effects of climate change for the urban poor? So how do typhoons or earthquakes affect our urban poor? So hopefully, okay, I can see some answers already. Of course, there is loss of lives. What else? But there are lots of effects of the climate and disaster events like flooding. Our urban poor are always affected of these climate effects. So I can already see destroy homes, health issues, of course, and the urban poor is already devastated from the climate and disaster event. So thank you for all these answers. I can see that there are a lot of answers about livelihood and homes, and of course there is loss of lives. So I agree that all of these are some of the reasons why there is a need for investment in urban poor housing. Thank you for participating. I can see already that there are a lot of answers. Thank you. And now we will proceed to part one. May I present again Engineer Lizzie Blaisdell Collins for the importance of using climate and disaster risk information for pro-poor investments in housing.
Thank you. As Sam noted, part one of this presentation will address why it is important to use climate and disaster risk information in designing pro-poor investments in housing. This will be broken down into two main points. First, examine why housing investments for the urban poor is essential, and then how climate and disaster risk informed investment in housing can build resilience of the urban poor. So to get started, first we'll establish that overall, investment in housing for the urban poor is essential. Substandard housing exacerbates the vulnerability of the urban poor in several ways, including limited or no access to basic services for different reasons, such as lack of community infrastructure and lack of land tenure. Their housing is also typically more exposed and vulnerable to hazards due to poor design and construction practices, inadequate sanitation, and location of housing in higher risk areas, leaving the urban poor more at risk. Substandard housing also exacerbates inequalities, such as those related to gender. Women, for example, are often more likely to spend more time at home due to societal norms and to run home-based businesses. They are therefore more exposed to and affected by poor housing conditions. Also, certain restrictions limit the ability of the urban poor to adequately invest in resilient housing themselves. Urban poor often rely on the informal economy and informal housing sector, and because of this, they cannot typically access traditional financing such as mortgages or construction loans, and they lack access to key technical assistance that can make their homes more resilient. While microfinancing does offer a solution in some cases, these institutions also have limited funding sources themselves. The government's investment is critical then, both to support families with incentives and knowledge to build and make their homes more resilient, as well as to bridge gaps in access to financing for the poor. Finally, many governments already have programs and policies that acknowledge the critical role of quality housing for the urban poor. Acknowledging that investments in housing for the urban poor is essential, we now will focus on why those investments must be climate and disaster risk informed to best build the resilience of the urban poor. First, we'll step back and take a look at the concepts of climate and disaster risk and how they interact with the housing sector. Disaster risk is commonly considered as a function of the severity and frequency of hazards, the exposure to those hazards, and the vulnerability of people and assets to damage or impact. Whether the hazards put people and homes at risk, and to what extent, is determined by their level of exposure to the hazards and their existing vulnerability. Natural hazards, including hydrometeorological hazards such as floods, extreme heat, and tropical cyclones, and geophysical such as earthquakes and volcanoes, as well as other hazards like human-caused threats and biological hazards like disease, contamination, fire, and crime, can all pose risks to housing and its occupants. Exposure for housing and households is the degree of possible contact between the house or household and a potentially harmful event. In terms of housing and vulnerability, both household vulnerability and housing vulnerability must be considered. Household vulnerability relates to their economic status and can affect their capacity to anticipate, cope with, resist, and recover from disasters. Housing vulnerability relates to how susceptible a home is to the failure, damage, or other problems due to hazards. It is influenced by deficiencies in the physical properties of the building, such as the materials used, the quality of the construction and design, the layout of the building, the interconnection of the building elements, and the level of maintenance for the building. For example, a roof that is not well connected to the rest of the building is vulnerable and unlikely to withstand a powerful cyclone. When we consider all the impacts of climate change on risk, we can see that it can influence all parts of the equation. In particular, for hydrometeorological hazards, climate change is increasing the severity and frequency of these events. Stronger winds, rising sea levels, more frequent heat waves, more rain, and higher flood levels. As these hazards are affected, so are the areas exposed. Locations that were not prone to flooding will start to see flooding, and extreme temperatures, will begin to affect broader areas. While rapid urbanization is not new, it can continue to accelerate due to climate change as more people are displaced due to its effects. In 2019 alone, some 24 million internal displacements were registered worldwide due to climate-induced extreme natural events. Rapid urbanization can lead to rises in household and housing vulnerability if not addressed. Clearly, investments in housing must consider climate and disaster risk. This is particularly important in building the resilience of the urban poor. The urban poor are at the front lines of disasters. They're disproportionately affected by them and also most vulnerable to them. Their housing is typically highly exposed and highly vulnerable as a result of both being located in more hazard-prone areas due to scarce and expensive land in cities, as well as being inadequately and informally built. Housing is a way to ensure that basic needs are met, and it can be lost due to climate change events and disasters. The World Bank found that poor people suffer 2 times more than average due to disasters. Climate and disaster risk-informed investments in housing help to prevent disasters. Housing is a key component to providing protection to the most vulnerable against these threats when it's designed to take them into account. Housing is an asset, and it provides an opportunity for growth and livelihoods. These must be preserved through risk-informed design so that the individuals and/or the government's investment in the housing asset is not lost in the next extreme event. Further, cost-benefit studies across different countries, including Nepal, Vietnam, and the United States, have found positive benefit-to-cost ratios for investing in more resilient housing. A house is the ultimate protection for people and families, and making housing more resilient, both for extreme events as well as everyday threats, is foundational to building the resilience of the urban poor.
Thank you, Lizzie, for that insightful presentation of part 1. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to put it in the Q&A box. So before we proceed with part 2, let's have a pop quiz. Again, kindly refer to the Mentimeter below our live stream to answer this question. So our question for this pop quiz is, which of the following risk components can be influenced through investments in housing? So is it A, hazards, B, exposure, C, house vulnerability, or D, household vulnerability? So which of these risk components can be influenced through investments in housing? Can you influence a hazard, or perhaps your exposure? Or how about your house vulnerability and household vulnerability? I think these risk components could be influenced, some of them. What do you think, guys? So, actually, this is a trick question. Maybe we can have Engineer Lizzie explain this further, why the 3 are correct.
Yeah, well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for the responses. Hazards, particularly climate-related natural hazards, they're typically spatial in nature, and the presence and severity of hazards for a house or a housing project are determined by its site or by its location. So given that they are location-based, there's a low ability actually for housing investments to change the hazard at a particular site or city. However, housing investments can influence levels of exposure to hazards to some degree. As we'll talk about later, some risk can be reduced through reducing exposure, such as through choosing the right site with a low hazard exposure, or through relocation and resettlement programs for those already exposed, or also community infrastructure, which will be covered tomorrow in tomorrow's learning session. So sometimes These projects, though, can be complex to deliver, especially for existing exposures that may already be embedded at the intersection of both geographic constraints as well as the social and economics of a city. The easiest way actually to influence climate and disaster risk for housing at the household level for the urban poor is through investments that target reduction of vulnerability. And in the next part, we'll talk a bit more about how these different components of climate and disaster risk can be considered when you're designing pro-poor housing investments.
Thank you, Lizzie. So we will have another question in our Mentimeter. So our next question is, what kind of housing projects have you been involved in? So we want to know now, in your previous projects, what kind of housing project or any housing related projects have you been involved with? Is it like new housing? Have you been involved in a subdivision, or is it high rise? So we want to know from the participants the housing projects that you've been involved with. I can see some answers. Affordable housing for the urban poor is one answer. Are you guys involved with like medium rise, or let's see, post-disaster reconstruction? Yeah, is a housing related project for urban poor. Renovation is one. Thank you for these answers, or we can already see some of the answers. Thank you everyone for answering. Let's see if we have other answers. There's new construction, of course, and then housing studies are made. These housing projects, of course, use climate and disaster risk information, and that's something that Lizzie can talk about in the second part. Resilient housing, new housing, environment for housing through coordinating the family. National building codes is another housing project. My own new house, yeah, of course, it is. That is something that you can use climate and disaster risk information. Thank you, everyone. It's nice to see a variety of housing projects in this group. I know that a lot of our participants are involved with housing. So for now, let's now hear from Lizzie for the second part of our learning session.
In part 2 of this learning session, we will explore ways to use and integrate climate and disaster risk information in designing pro-poor investments in housing so that resilience of the urban poor can be better built. We will look at first different entry points for using climate and disaster risk information in pro-poor housing investments. Thanks to all that responded to the question about housing-related projects. When we look at investments in housing for building the resilience of the urban poor, we can divide these into direct investments and indirect investments. Direct investments are implemented by the government or government partners to directly create or address new housing, improve or maintain existing housing, resettlement and relocation programs, or programs for establishing land tenure and access to basic services. Indirect investments aim to address the financial, social, and technical systemic barriers to resilient housing, the root causes of climate and disaster risk for the urban poor. These may include initiatives to develop, improve, and/or enforce policies and building standards, to provide and improve access to education and training for actors in the housing sector, or to build awareness across different stakeholder groups, both about risk as well as ways to reduce risk in housing. In our experience globally, we found that investments are most effective in building resilience when they combine to leverage both indirect and direct initiatives. We'll look first at direct investments and ways to use climate and disaster risk in designing direct investment initiatives for pro-poor urban housing. At different stages in the design of the investment program, there are different ways to use climate and disaster risk information, from identifying and validating or prioritizing locations, to developing a strategy, to defining the specific goals and methodologies of the investment, and to maybe most importantly, identifying the investment levels needed. One of the basic questions for a pro-poor housing investment is where to invest. Is there a priority area, or is the potential area suitable for investment? Disaster and climate risk information is essential to consider in answering these questions. This can be done through a disaster risk assessment, which overlays the hazard, exposure, and vulnerability information in order to understand the spatial distribution of risk across a country, region, city, or even neighborhood. Many countries and cities have already taken initiative to consider climate and disaster risk in developing land use plans, so it's always advised to check where risk information has already been incorporated into these plans and follow their guidance. Given that we know climate change is a changing risk, you can also check to see if the risk assessments developed for the land use plans have also taken into account the changing risk. For new housing investments, these are important because it is better to develop on sites in low hazard areas and avoid increasing risk. Whereas for investments in existing housing, it may be important to target areas with the highest risk in order to reduce risk. If an existing disaster risk assessment is not available, one can be developed through looking at the hazards, exposure, and vulnerability information of the area. Hazard maps and sometimes even risk maps are available digitally in many cases. Here are 3 examples from Indonesia, the Philippines, and Bangladesh. Due to its spatial nature, natural and climate-related hazards are frequently conveyed through maps. They are typically based on historical records, on science, and on modeling, particularly to consider changing risk in the future, such as those due to climate change. If a home is expected to last 35, 50, or even 75 years, the way hazards may change over that time frame should be considered. Looking at a few examples of hazard maps, here we see a typical wind speed map taken from the National Structural Code of the Philippines. Building codes usually define the wind speeds across the country or location that should be considered in designing housing and other structures. Building codes should also be maintained and updated regularly in order to take into account changing hazard levels. There is also an example here from the seismic design acceleration maps from the National Standard of Indonesia, which are used to determine the severity of earthquake forces that houses and buildings should be designed to resist. Seismic design hazard maps can also often be found in the building code for a country or location. Flood inundation maps can be used to understand the depth and location of flooding or projected flooding in an area, which can be used to determine how high housing should be elevated or where it should be located to avoid inundation. In Bangladesh, the Ministry of Disaster Management developed inundation maps both for the current hazard, like the example on the left, as well as the projected hazard in the future, the example on the right. You can see that the flooding in the future is projected to be more severe due to climate change. Exposure information can be found in several ways. Census and population data can be examined, or alternatively, an inventory over a specific area can be generated. Exposure information can tell you how many people or households, as well as housing units, are exposed to certain hazards when this inventory or population and census data, or projected population in the case of new developments, is superimposed with hazard maps. Developing exposure information can also leverage technology. For example, using image processing techniques and aerial or street view imagery can help to automate the creation of housing inventories. For vulnerability, it is important to develop information on both housing vulnerability as well as on household vulnerability. Household vulnerability can be examined through indicators such as socioeconomic status, household composition, and neighborhood and zoning characteristics. In most cases, the household vulnerability of the urban poor can be considered high. Housing vulnerability information can be developed in several ways and can best be organized by grouping houses by building typology which share similar characteristics such as construction system, number of stories, materials, etc., and are also likely to share similar deficiencies which can lead to vulnerabilities. Housing subsector studies are one way to better understand the needs and opportunities for reducing housing vulnerability. Housing subsector studies examine the houses themselves, the types, the materials, the structural systems, layout, size, functionality, etc. They also examine housing preferences. Where do people cook, bathe, sleep, or use the toilet? And how can housing better meet their needs? Housing subsector studies also include construction materials assessment. What is the quality of materials? Where are they produced or procured? and how much do they cost? These studies also include a workforce needs assessment. What is the skill level of the housing builders? What tools and techniques do they use? How do they build the houses? Who builds the houses and how much do they earn? Are engineers or architects normally consultant, or what are their roles? Field surveys combined with engineering assessment can also be used to develop vulnerability information, examining the types of housing, their common deficiencies, both from a disaster vulnerability as well as habitability standpoint. These field surveys can use sampling techniques to understand the changing nature and distribution of various typologies in the housing stock across different areas of a city or location. Finally, historical data and investigations on building performance in past disasters can also add information to the assessment of housing vulnerability. When referencing historic impacts, though, it's important to keep in mind the potential changes in climate disaster risk in the future. As discussed previously, housing for the urban poor is commonly highly vulnerable for many reasons. Next, we'll look at how climate and disaster risk information can help inform an investment strategy to better build the resilience of the urban poor. Understanding how different hazards affect housing and what the best option for addressing the applicable hazards are in terms of housing investment is critical to designing the right investment. Oftentimes, national and local housing plans already include strategies for addressing risk, and so it's important to consult those and follow their guidance in designing pro-poor housing investments. Overall, there are two main ways to address risk in housing for the urban poor. The first is to reduce risk. This can be done effectively through either or both reducing exposure and reducing vulnerability. Then, as it is typically impossible to fully eliminate risk, it is also important to address risk through managing the residual or remaining risk. Here we examine the effectiveness of different strategies for addressing risk across a variety of hazards in terms of housing. The pink highlighted hazards are those that are affected by climate change, such as high winds, biological hazards, extreme heat, floods, and landslide. For high winds, biological, and earthquake hazards, the most effective investment strategy, as shown by the green checkmark, is to reduce the vulnerability of the house to those hazards. Reducing exposure can be effective in some cases, as shown by the orange checkmark. For example, in the case of high winds, avoiding sites that are more susceptible to high winds, like ridges near open bodies of water. Managing the residual risk is also an effective strategy, as shown by the yellow checkmark, such as developing early warning systems and evacuation plans and awareness ahead of windstorms. For extreme heat, a combination of strategies is effective, including reducing vulnerability by using insulating materials, light painted surfaces such as white roofs, and improving ventilation, as well as access to drinking water and electricity in the home. And by reducing exposure to urban heat island effects by applying the concepts of blue, green, and white cities for space and infrastructure improvements. And also by managing the residual risk by keeping people informed of the signs and risks of heat stress, as well as developing community cooling centers. For hazards such as flood, landslide, and volcanoes, the most effective strategies relate to reducing exposure. This may include location or relocation of houses outside of exposed areas, or developing protective infrastructure, like green or gray infrastructure in the case of flooding. Tomorrow's learning session will cover these infrastructure topics in more detail. Reducing the vulnerability to flooding, such as through elevating a house, is only applicable in some cases and can be expensive and challenging depending on the situation. Managing the residual risk is an effective strategy too, so that people can prepare for flooding, such as moving electrical equipment or contents to a high elevation or evacuating ahead of flooding for safety. Finally, for tsunamis, which are generated by earthquakes, managing the residual risk is likely the most effective strategy for investment. This information can be used, for example, in specifying an investment strategy, depending on the type of investment. For example, an investment on existing housing for the urban poor that is at risk of flooding may most effectively be directed at relocation or resettlement programs. whereas investments on existing housing for the urban poor that are at risk of high winds can focus on investing in improving the house to reduce deficiencies. Conversely, new housing investments should aim to focus on development in areas that are not at risk of flooding and aim to follow the required building standards and practices to ensure that houses exposed to high winds are not vulnerable to their effects. Next, we'll look at defining investment goals and methodologies through developing solutions that are responsive to climate and disaster risk information. The goals and methodologies to be used in housing investments for the urban poor should be responsive to the climate and disaster risk information collected. They should cater to address the exposures and the vulnerabilities as applicable, as well as the sources of vulnerability identified through the housing subsector studies. When we look at addressing sources of vulnerability in a program design, we can consider the full construction value chain, from the assessment and collection of information and data, through the sharing of information through building awareness, to the design, including standards and professional capacity, to the financing, then the construction, including the quality of materials, techniques, and capacity of builders, to the reporting and feedback mechanisms. Where existing gaps in this chain exist, the program design should seek to fill them in order to better address the sources of vulnerability to climate and disaster risk. Looking specifically at particular goals and methodologies related to the houses themselves, when defining the goals for investment, it is important to consider the climate and disaster risk information. In this example, the goal was to reduce the vulnerability of the house to the effects of tropical winds, earthquakes, extreme heat, and biological threats. Additionally, the requests of the homeowner were also considered. They want to have more space for rental income, a better kitchen near the back door, improved security, including keeping their masonry and concrete walls. An assessment of the home finds several vulnerabilities in the house. There is a non-engineered roof with a sheet metal covering. Rain leaks into the house, and the metal roof with no ceiling below creates a hot interior. It's also found that the roof is susceptible to damage in the next strong windstorm. There are also large openings in the front of the house which reduce the strength of the wall against earthquake and high winds, but are also boarded up due to security concerns, which reduces the ventilation and airflow in the house. There are no windows in the toilet or the interior bedroom, lacking ventilation and adequate airflow, which can increase indoor air temperatures. Some of the interior walls are built out of timber, which is susceptible to rot and infestation, as well as being ineffective at bracing the exterior masonry walls against earthquake and high winds. Finally, there is a shared wall with a neighbor, making the buildings structurally dependent on each other and generating potentially damaging irregularities in earthquakes and high winds. The designed investment for this house, which were able to reduce its vulnerability and risk against climate and disaster threats, were simple and cost-effective. The most expensive being the addition of a white-covered concrete slab roof, which not only resists leaks, high winds, and heat absorption, but provides the option for future vertical expansion for the family to better achieve the rental income space they want in the future. Awnings at the front of the house and a covered space at the back door reduce water intrusion to the house and provide additional shade to help with indoor cooling. New windows at the toilet and back door, as well as a new light well, increase access to fresh air, ventilation, and natural light, while also helping with indoor cooling. While some of the openings were closed in the front wall to strengthen the wall against earthquakes and high winds, the openings that remained were provided with security grills so that they could be safely kept operable, overall adding to the natural lighting, ventilation, and indoor cooling of the house. New masonry walls to separate the building from the neighbor's wall and to partition the interior rooms were provided. These help reduce irregularity in the structure and add strength to better withstand the effects of earthquakes and high winds, as well as support a future vertical expansion. Finally, gutters and a downspout were added to collect rain from the roof and control site runoff, and a kitchen was also improved. Finally, but maybe most importantly, related to direct investments, I'll talk about using the climate and disaster risk information to identify investment levels. These 4 points may be done in sequence, or this may be an iterative process as the required investment levels are identified and the other actions are adjusted to fit within the budget constraints. After using climate and disaster risk information to select locations, develop a strategy, and determine specific goals and methodologies for a program, the investment levels should be determined to ensure that it's adequate to successfully achieve the targeted impacts and objectives. 3 different levels of investment are required to make sure there is success. First, the cost of the planned construction or improvements. This may include things like materials and labor, demolition and transportation, or land and site development in the case of new construction. Second, the cost of program implementation. This includes not only project management and administration, but also program level investments in filling the identified gaps in the construction value chain for housing, such as communication and awareness building, feedback mechanisms, technical assistance, and quality assurance and control systems. And third, the cost of system change innovation should be considered. We'll talk more about this next in indirect investments, but even direct investments can support important system-level shifts through strategic assessment and planning activities, as well as knowledge sharing and management. This brings us to the topic of indirect investments and how climate and disaster risk information can inform indirect investments in housing to build the resilience of the urban poor. By understanding and diagnosing root causes of climate and disaster risk in housing ecosystems, opportunities for systemic improvements in housing can be identified and developed. These can pair with direct investments to leverage effectiveness, or they can be done standalone. To identify the root causes of climate and disaster risk in the housing ecosystem, the ecosystem should be mapped and studied. Gaps and challenges leading to these risks in housing are brought to the surface, and investment actions to address them can be prioritized. Global experience in developing and implementing resilient housing for low-income and poor households has shown that there are 3 key factors to be mapped. These are people and policy, including levels of climate and disaster risk awareness, demand for resilient housing, and policy effectiveness. Money, including access to funding at all 3 levels discussed. And technology, looking at the construction value chain and the use of tech to streamline the supply of more resilient housing. These items can be assessed through market and housing subsector studies, which are often combined with stakeholder consultations and field investigations for more depth. BuildChange has developed a framework specific to this based on our experience in these types of assessments. This is called the Resilient Housing Ecosystem Assessment Tool, or RHEAT. RHEAT is included in the BuildChange Guide to Resilient Housing, which is publicly available on our website at www.buildchange.org. The tool walks through indicators and assigns a score for each to give an overall snapshot of the ecosystem and the gaps and opportunities across the 3 main barriers of people and policy, money, and technology. Before we close part 2, I wanted to share a case study of using climate and disaster risk information to design a pro-poor housing investment in the Philippines. This case study focuses on working with microfinance institutions, or MFIs, to create resilient housing loan products. This has been implemented at a local level to improve existing housing to be more resilient against climate and disaster risks, through support of targeted technical assistance, while also creating new lines of business for MFIs, which are a common source of housing and commercial finance for the urban poor. The program idea initiated with observing compounding gaps and challenges in poor and low-income households were having in the face of repetitive disasters in the Philippines, which is a country with high and growing levels of risk across many different types of hazards. Looking across the 3 main barriers to adoption of resilient housing at scale in the Philippines, found that while policies and understanding of risk were relatively developed for housing, implementation of policies, particularly in construction of housing for poorer households, as well as understanding of and access to disaster resilient construction practices were low. Access to adequate financing for more resilient housing was also low, although it was common to use MFI loan products to make other more limited housing improvements. A market study was also performed to better understand the potential market for resilient housing loans. Out of the estimated 15.6 million vulnerable housing units, it was determined that approximately 8.6 million of those could be catered to by an MFI loan product. Indirect investments were made to develop technical resources and training to address the identified gaps and advocate and partner with MFIs to initiate and pilot home strengthening loan products. There are currently 4 MFI partners offering home strengthening loan products with a projected impact on 100 households by the end of 2021. The specific direct investment example we'll look at here is for a program in Quezon City where one of the MFI partners had a client base. For this area, Hazard Hunter was consulted to understand the applicable hazards and overall levels of exposure. Most of the residents were highly exposed to earthquake and winds, and there were pockets of flooding hazards in the area. The National Structural Code of the Philippines was consulted to understand the design hazard levels for earthquakes and winds. A housing study was performed in the projected areas of intervention to identify the building types, their common deficiencies, and the extent of vulnerability for those targeted types. This also provided an opportunity to interview homeowners and occupants to understand their housing preferences and needs. Looking at the applicable hazards and considering the investment would be targeting improving existing housing, the following investment strategy was developed. For reducing risks, houses exposed to flooding and landslide would be excluded from the program in order to avoid inadvertently reinforcing or increasing exposure to those hazards. Specific interventions would be offered to reduce the vulnerability of houses to typhoons and earthquakes, while ensuring that key architectural elements for mitigating extreme heat, like longer roof overhangs, could be maintained. Basic repairs to the home, such as replacing damaged roofing, would also be made, which can improve habitability. Also, the strengthening loan product would be offered in conjunction with an existing loan product for other habitability upgrades. To help reduce household vulnerability, the loans would be offered in affordable increments. And also a product would be developed for adding a second-story slab for future vertical expansion and potential rental income. Finally, to help manage residual risk, the program would include a strategy of building awareness through climate and disaster risk information campaigns. Overall, the program solution took an incremental approach to build resilience through a menu of loan options based on homeowner preference and affordability. The scope items were prioritized and grouped to ensure that resilience would be improved at each step. First, looking at repairing existing damages, then stabilizing the structure in the roof, in the walls, or both, and then adding strengthening elements to increase the disaster resistance. The program design incorporated responsive solutions along the construction value chain based on the collected climate and disaster risk information, from building awareness in the community and client base about typhoons and earthquakes, to providing streamlined, simple, and clear tools to the MFIs and homeowners in order to assess, scope, and select the desired and needed loan for each house. To support quality construction, detailed visual guidance was developed for the homeowner's builder to implement each of the selected scope of work activities, while visual and tailored guidance was provided to the MFI officers for reviewing and checking the quality and progress of the selected loan options. And training materials and training of trainers was provided to the MFI staff for the use of the tools and resources, and also for training homeowners and builders in their respective roles in the construction value chain for resilient housing. As part of the investment design process, the levels of investment were identified. Through defining the different actions to reduce vulnerability and grouping them together, estimates of the construction costs for different loan options could be assessed to help ensure affordability at different increments. Homeowners would take out loans to pay for the materials and labor according to the selected loan option. They also had to invest their own time in attending the trainings and managing the builder that they hired. The MFI partners had to assess and make available capital investments for the loans themselves in order to be dispersed, as well as plan their investment for program operational expenses for logistics, staffing, and training. Build Change also had to plan levels of investment at the program level to provide technical assistance, develop tools and resources, and provide capacity building and piloting. Further, systems level investments are being made in advocacy and awareness raising to help influence market actors to support and adopt the program initiatives. That concludes the case study and also part 2 of the learning session. Thank you.
Thank you, Lizzie, for that interesting presentation of part 2. We are now ready for the questions that you had posted in the Q&A box. I will read out the questions in order of priority based on your likes given to them. So are you ready, Lizzie? So our first question is, how hazard and vulnerability are addressed for designing investments for pro-poor housing designing?
Great. Yeah, thank you, Sam. And I hope the presentation helped to answer this question. I saw it pop up early on, and I think that when we look at these investments, as I mentioned, we can break those into kind of indirect as well as direct investments. And there's ways to incorporate these or address these issues within those investments. For the hazard, looking at the right strategy. From the vulnerability, understanding what those vulnerabilities are and developing responsive solutions to them. So, please go ahead and continue to add some questions if you'd like more information on any of those aspects.
The second question is, governments in third world countries always promise free housing for the poor. How can multilateral funding agencies help them fulfill their promises?
Great. Yeah, that's a great question. I think that I don't want to speak for multilateral funding agencies, but I think when you consider disaster and climate risk information in housing investment designs, it becomes a better investment because mentioned previously, those investments can be protected into the future. So I think demonstrating that these risks and are being mitigated against and being improved, I think can attract or help different agencies find those investments to be appealing. Versus investments that are planned without considering climate and disaster risk information, can continue to be at risk. Those investments and those assets that are made won't necessarily be protected into the future, and so there's a bit more risk there with the investment.
The next question is, what makes urban poor housing critical compared to housing in the rural communities?
That's another great question. So I happen to think that all housing is critical, both urban housing as well as rural housing. I think what sets urban housing apart in a lot of cases is the concentration of risk. In urban areas, there are just so many more households, housing units exposed in a smaller, more dense area. And that really increases these pockets of risk where less, smaller scale events can have a higher impact because they're able to affect a larger population, a larger set of infrastructure, including housing infrastructure, all at the same time. And so I think urban housing is critical because of that, although I also think rural housing is also critical for those families that live in rural communities.
Thank you, Liz. For the next question, providing highly subsidized housing in far-flung relocation areas with limited or absence of livelihood and community facilities has shown mixed results over the years. Can access to credit financing for the poor to enable them to seek out housing on their own be an alternative potential? What examples do we have on access for credit financing for household housing?
Yeah, that's another, so many good questions. And I hope that the example, the case study of the MFI partnership gave a little insight into this. In this case, what we found to be really helpful in terms of making those financing accessible to the households, particularly the low income and poorer households, was incrementalizing the improvements to help address risk, or whether it's new construction or addressing risk in existing housing, making those in affordable increments so that the loan options for those homeowners were affordable. What we found is that even when you do that, even when you make financing more affordable, there's a couple of constraints still. A lot of microfinance institutions have limited resources themselves, and so they also need to have better access to larger pools of wholesale financing to help them mitigate some of their risk in these loans on these low income houses, as well as there also should be an opportunity for the poor homeowners, the super poor or ultra poor, I think is the term, who may not, even with these incremental improvements, it still may be out of their reach to afford some sort of financial access, such as a microfinance loan. And so even in some cases, we're still looking at how can we get subsidies and grants to homeowners who really can't afford it, even when financing is made more accessible. So there's definitely lots of ways to break down the market. And the market study I mentioned showed that roughly half or slightly more than half of the vulnerable housing units, for example, in the Philippines, could be catered to by an MFI product, meaning that would be affordable, to those homeowners.
Next question, thank you, Lizzie, is what are some challenges when it comes to climate and disaster risk information in investment decisions?
Yes, I think in all of the points that we laid out, all the different ways to incorporate climate and disaster risk, there's going to be challenges along all of those points. Sometimes it's going to be accessing information. Sometimes it's going to be in trade-offs in decision making. So sometimes you might need to kind of iterate on the design process because you find out that the investment that you want to make in order to make it well is outside of the budget. And so you have to look at how can you iterate on the process to maybe solve some of those issues. And you also need to maybe find out ways to improve your access to information or to be able to make decisions with the information that you have. I think one thing that can happen is that when it comes to housing investments, sometimes if too much time is spent investing in investigating things and not in taking action and not in moving forward, you can also kind of work against yourself. So it's important to continue to kind of move forward on the path that you want to have in order to improve housing, make it more resilient, and not necessarily get stuck doing study after study after study after study. At a certain point, you have to use what you have and move forward.
The next question is, selection of recipients of direct investments in housing for the poor is oftentimes politically done. What can donor multilateral agencies do to lessen the politics?
That's an interesting question. And I think there's probably a few different answers here. When it comes to housing, I think that by using not just social criteria or political criteria, by using some sort of a transparent system like technical criteria related to levels of risk and and that can happen. That can help to make investments more the thought process behind selection of areas and investments more transparent. So, for example, setting out, well, we're going to make sure that we're investing in areas that have low hazard, or we're going to make sure that we're going to address the areas that have the highest risk to typhoons or strong winds, because we're going to target reducing vulnerability in those areas. So by having these climate and disaster risk pieces of information, it can actually help create a more transparent selection criteria.
Maybe we can accommodate this is the last question. Can you share examples of resilient pro-poor housing program that included a holistic settlement approach that includes access to transport, livelihood, and social services?
Yeah, that's interesting question. I think that brings up a lot of important points when it comes to resettlement programs. So a lot of times, if resettlement programs aren't thought out, they can restrict, they can actually create more problems than they're trying to solve, right? They can create issues with lack of access to services, to infrastructure, to networks, and even social nets. So one of the things that we find to be kind of a solution to that in the cases where it's feasible, of course, based on the applicable hazards and things, is to improve existing housing where it is. This provides the opportunity to create a more resilient community, but the community that was already there. It also creates opportunities to safely densify existing communities. And we've found that it actually can be cost effective. We recently did a study where we looked at the cost of improving existing housing globally, and we found that from all of the different disaster risk mitigation programs that we've done in Asia, in Latin America, and the Caribbean, and also the Pacific, we found that on average, the cost of improving existing housing was around 23% of the cost of new construction for the same areas. And when you take into account densifying the existing housing, first improving what's there and then building on top of it, the cost there was also less than new construction, considering for new construction, you also have to usually develop land and purchase land. Yeah, so thanks.
Thank you so much, everyone, for all of your questions and comments that you shared with the group. So for unanswered questions, we will refer it to Lizzie and post them together with her answers in the housing discussion board that you can find in the discussion group on the left side. On the left side of your screen, you can find the discussion group and the housing discussion. There, you can find on the left side. So you can just select the housing, and then you can click the pink icon at the lower part. So you can add in your, maybe you have some lingering questions there. So we can ask Lizzie to answer them later. So we will now move to the final activity of this learning session. So for the closing activity, we will be using this same board, Padlet in the discussion board, the one that we showed you, where you can post the answer to this question. So the question is, if you were to design an urban pro-poor housing investment, what kind of information would you need to collect to guide your planning? So we're looking forward to all of your answers. And of course, you can still answer this question even after our session or whenever you have time to think about it. And thank you so much for all of your answers in the housing question before. Okay, so I'm sure you would agree that we had a highly informative and interesting session this morning. So as the discussion goes, we can. I like what you said, Lizzie, that all housing is critical, but there is a concentration of risk in the urban poor. So we have to have like financing and working together from governments, microfinance institutions, banks, and other private institutions to have financing so that these climate and disaster risks, the vulnerability, the exposure, household vulnerability could be addressed. So this thank you so much for all of your questions. And you know that this learning session was aimed to enhance the awareness and appreciation of the importance of using climate and disaster risk information in designing proper investments in housing. We would like to know your feedback, of course, about how successful we were in meeting our objective. So kindly accomplish an online evaluation form through the feedback box in the right side of your screen to answer that one question if we were successful in meeting our objective. Okay, so as we close the session, let me thank our resource person and co-lead, Engineer Lizzie Blaisdell-Collins, for sharing her expertise with us. Thank you, Lizzie, and we can't see each other, but let us all give her a round of virtual applause. Thank you, Lizzie.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you so much to the organizers. It was a great session. Thanks for everyone who participated.
Yeah. And of course, we would like to thank you all for joining us this morning. We hope to see you again in the remaining sessions of this forum. We also look forward to reading your feedback in the session evaluation. Thank you and have a pleasant afternoon, everyone.